I had a splendid voice. In fact, I'd sing in opera if they'd give me my choice. I wrote to Oscar Hammerstein that I would be his star. He said, come down and sing for me, and I'll see how good you are. And I don't suppose I'll do it again for months and months and months. No, I don't suppose I'll do it again for months and months and months. I sang the wise old owl, and he left the room at once. So I don't suppose I'll do it again for months and months and months.
Welcome to the Recluse's Cookbook. This time it's my pleasure to have Northern Irish writer Brian McGiloway on the Recluse's Cookbook. Brian arrived on the crime fiction scene with his 2007 debut novel Borderlands. It was favourably received by fans and critics alike, and it began the hugely successful Inspector Devlin mysteries, which has spawned 5 follow-up novels. In addition to this, he has published 3 standalone novels, and he has created a second series of books featuring the female protagonist, Lucy Black. In this interview, Brian discusses how he fell in love with crime fiction, why nothing that is said to a writer is ever lost, and he gives some very sound advice to budding new writers. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I give you Brian McGilloway.
Okay, Brian, so tell us who you are and what it is that you're best known to for the public.
My name is Brian McGilloway, and I am a crime writer from originally from Derry, but I live in Strabane now, and have done for about the past 20 years, just on the border, and I write crime novels, all of which are kind of set in this area between kind of the Derry, Tyrone, Donegal borders.
So you're a crime writer. You began your career with the Benedict Devlin series. Were you always a reader? Were you an avid reader of crime fiction beforehand, or was it something that you just started writing and it came out?
A bit of both, I suppose. Like I know an awful lot of crime writers that I know read a lot of crime when they were younger and kind of grew up on kind of reading classic crime and Agatha Christie and all this kind of stuff. I probably not so much. I read a lot when I was young, and I wrote all the time. I mean, even kind of I remember when I was about kind of 8 or 9, writing stories and kind of putting them together into wee books, stapling the books together, um, and I suppose what happened was I remember just after I'd finished my degree at Queen's, so I did English in Queen's, just after I finished, a crime bookshop opened on Botanic Avenue in Belfast, a place called No Alibis, which is still there, fantastic independent bookshop. Um, and I was walking past, and I hadn't really read a lot of crime per se. I probably had read books that were crime novels, but hadn't read them because they were crime novels. But growing up, I watched an awful lot of TV, detective dramas, partly because my father, when my father was very young, he lost almost all his hearing. He had meningitis when he was an infant, and so we watched TV shows that were subtitled. And the only programs that were reliably subtitled in the kind of 80s and early 90s were the midweek cop dramas, the
Mm.
Inspector Morses and Touch of Frost and what have you. So I used to watch that with him. We would sit, my mum and dad and my brothers and sister had kind of gone to uni or gone wherever at that stage. And so I watched an awful lot of those kind of characters. And I remember going into No Alibis after it opened and seeing an omnibus of the Inspector Morse, first 3 Morse books. And I thought I must get it for my dad. And Ian Rankin's Black and Blue was sitting as well, and I liked the cover on it. I thought, okay, I'll give this a go. Why not? And that night I read, I think, 2 of the 3 Morse books through the night. And then read the last of them the next morning, and went in that afternoon and went, right, what else have you got? And just started kind of devouring crime novels. So that was actually where I started reading crime because I knew it to be crime, as opposed to kind of reading crime novels that were kind of coincidentally crime, if that makes sense. Um, and I probably read almost nothing but crime for about maybe 10 years, particularly crime series. So things like Morse, and Rebus, and the Harry Bosch series, the Michael Connolly, and the Charlie Parker series, the John Connolly, which are superb. Um, and loved this idea of having a character that you could come back to every year, and that you could kind of reacquaint yourself with. Um, and I remember, whenever I think it was about 28, 29, um, Ian Rankin was retiring Rebus. Morse was dead. The Remorseful Day had been written. And one of the series that I was a particular fan of was James Lee Burke's, or is James Lee Burke's, the Dave Robichaux series, which are stunningly good. And there was one of those that I was reading, I think it was Last Card of Elysian Fields. Um, and Robichaux thinks he's having a heart attack. He's jogging in the park at dawn, and he takes a pain on his chest, and he kind of sits the park bench in the early morning mist and goes, "Is this it? Is this how it ends after everything?" And I remember feeling really sad about the fact that this character that I had spent so much time with, kind of reading one book after the other and having that voice inside your head, that character, and as I say, Morse and Rebus and all of these characters, all of these kind of friends, if you like, these literary friends, were all going. Um, and so, kind of rather foolishly and totally selfishly, I thought, right, well, I'm going to write. I'm going to write a story with a character that I would be quite happy once a year to take it down off the shelf and read through it again, and just spend some time with that. So I want to spend time with a character in whose company I would quite happily be.
Mm.
Uh, and that was Devlin. That was where the first Devlin book came from. It was very much a kind of a response to that sense of losing kind of literary friends with each of these series, looking as if they were going to end. Now, in the end of the Robichaux series didn't end, so I probably could have just left it. But
So, from what I'm gathering of this, is that the original book of Benedict Devlin, it was not for anyone else to read; it was for you to read.
totally, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't write it with any expectation of trying to get it published. I didn't write it with any expectation because, I mean, I kind of wrote it just, I suppose, to see if I could. And also just because I had these ideas. I mean, I had always written stories. I wrote a book whenever I was at university, a book called One So High, and showed it to kind of friends and that, and um, kind of thought enough of it that I sent it to one publisher.
Mhm.
Whenever I was about kind of 21, I think 2021. And they wrote back and said, not for us, it's overwritten and whatever. Here's a reader's report. And the reader's report was fairly critical of it. And I just went, right, well, it's obviously rubbish. And I put it in my drawer, never showed it to anybody ever again. I still have it, still in my drawer, it's still here. And I kind of decided, right, well, that's not much as I would love to be published. That's not the priority. And certainly when I started the Devlin, um, I did absolutely no research. It was literally just written off the top of my head. Kind of based, I suppose we all have a degree now of forensic understanding from watching TV shows.
Yeah.
So you kind of have an idea about what the processes are and an idea about kind of who's involved. Um, and so I wrote it, and when I finished it, while initially the idea was that it would be just for me, when I finished it, I kind of went, I wouldn't mind somebody else seeing this to see what they think, because I think it's not bad, but maybe somebody else. So I showed it to a friend of mine, a man called Bob McKim, and Bob read it and pointed out a lot of the glaring mistakes that were in it, and kind of went, you've done this, which was great because I didn't. I actually hadn't realized it, and I needed that kind of
Hmm.
fresh pair of eyes and somebody whose opinion I could trust, who wasn't just going to go, "Oh yeah, that's great, well done," but who also was going to be kind of positive about the good stuff while helping me with the other stuff. And he kind of said, you know, it's good. It's as good as any other crime novel that I've read. And he's a big crime fan. He said, why don't you try to get it published? And so I showed it to a few other people, and kind of got the same message. Yeah, it's not bad. Why don't you send it out there and see? So I sent it out, and by that stage I had met Jude Collins, who's a writer, a short story writer and journalist. He was one of my tutors when I was at teaching college. And Jude had said to me, we had kind of kept in contact, and then I sent him a bit of it and asked his opinion. He said, "Yeah, look, it's good. It's nice. It's well written." And he said, "Don't wait for somebody to come to you. Get the second one written while you're waiting to hear back about the first." And it was a brilliant piece of advice. And so I sent the book out and got multiple rejections on it. And one or two publishers and one or two agents held on to it for a while and were very positive about it, and then came back and went, look, it's not, crime's quite difficult to market, and it's quite expensive to sell. So, and then eventually, after I think about maybe 2 years, 2.5 years, Macmillan came back and said, yeah, we like this. How would you feel about cutting the prologue? Because it was a prologue at the start of it that was written in the third person, which was tonally completely out of place with the
Yeah.
rest of the book. And the editor kind of said, Will Atkins was the editor, and he said, how would you feel about pruning the prologue? And if you're agreeable to that, we'd be looking at publication next spring. And I remember getting the email. I was in class at the time teaching, and when the email came through, and I kind of had to excuse myself, go into the store cupboard and phone my wife, say, just got news. So, and of course, I wrote back and said, yeah, of course, the prologue's gone. That's a way around it. So yeah, so that was kind of how it happened. And the good thing was that because of Jude's advice, I already had the second Devlin written. I wrote the first one to see if I could, and I wrote the second one to see if I could do it twice. And that actually was a really useful thing to have, because it took pressure off me. The kind of the difficult second album pressure was actually on the third book rather than on the second, weirdly. And it also, I think, to a publisher, I think it's probably a bit more attractive, especially with crime and particularly with kind of a detective novel, if they feel that there's kind of the potential for a series, as opposed to them putting a lot of effort into try to kind of launching a single book that's not going to be developed on. So,
So, I suppose you've told us the journey you took to write the book, but can you tell us about who Benedict Devlin is, the type of person he is, his surroundings, so on and so forth?
yeah, absolutely. So Devlin, when I started the book, kind of strangely, I set it in Derry originally. So the very, very first draft, the first couple of pages, were set in Derry, because that's where I grew up. It's where I was born and I grew up. And what happened was I kind of needed to move some things geographically. So I kind of was imagining things happening on a particular street, but I needed there to be like a particular type of building in that street, and got so tied up with, no, everybody will know that that's not there, and people will know that that's not what that is, and that it kind of paralyzed me.
Mm.
And I also found that because around this time, the RUC, which was the old police force here, had just become the PSNI. And this was kind of this kind of new policing generation, and an attempt to make it more inclusive. But at the stage that I was writing, for example, Sinn Féin still hadn't signed up to the policing board. There were all kinds of issues going on, and I wanted to write a crime novel that wasn't political. And I kind of thought, if Devlin's a police officer in the north, it's almost impossible to avoid the politics that are going to surround that. And so to kind of free myself from both of those things, I went, well, maybe I should just move him across the border. And if I want to write about the North, I can write about it at a remove. I can look at it through his eyes. So that was the decision to have him as a guard rather than a PSNI officer. And the one thing that I knew I wanted for him, because I mean, I had read an awful lot of crime and loved it. Um, but there were a disproportionate, and it's probably wholly accurate, but a disproportionate number of divorced alcoholic detectives wisecracking over dead bodies, and I get why. I get where that comes from, and as I say, it's probably very accurate, but I kind of didn't see myself in that. I wanted a character who reflected my interests and who reflected the things that were important to me. And at that stage, I was newly married, and my wife was expecting, and then we had our first son, Ben, which is where Devlin got his name. Um, and I was trying, like I was teaching, and then I was writing, and I was trying to deal with having a new baby in the house, and kind of being married and all of those things, trying to balance all of those different things. And I wanted a detective who would kind of reflect that, who would reflect that trying to do their job and then coming home and having a family life. And that to me seemed more interesting than him going back and sitting by himself, kind of staring into the bottom of a glass. And so that was why very early on I knew that I wanted Devlin to be married, that I wanted him to have young children, and that I wanted him to be motivated not by kind of a desire for justice as an ideal, but motivated by the concept of his role was to keep that community safe because that community was where his family was. Um, and so that's kind of where he came from. And then the opening scene, which looking back on now, I kind of regret how that first book started because it has kind of become a cliche, I suppose, of crime drama. But it started with a girl's dead body lying in a field, and it's snowing on her remains. And quite early on in the first or second page, Devlin comments that he wanted to take his coat off and put it over her,
Hmm.
but he had to resist the urge to do it because of the kind of forensics work that was being done. And when I kind of wrote that line, I went, yeah, I know who you are now.
Hmm.
I understand exactly who you are and what everything that motivates you. That line is Devlin to me. And if anyone ever asks me who is he, that's who he is. He's the person who would want to protect somebody, who would want to comfort them, who would want to do the kind of the paternal action to protect their dignity.
So I kind of, what I love about it, again, I have a connection to this particular area. You could have picked, say, Bridgend or Buncrana to stick
I could
Benedict. You could have, you'd have your fair share of characters there as well. But you chose Lifford and Strabane. Uh, how did you come to that conclusion?
um,
Because it's just the geography of it. It's when I first started reading your book. I just immediately, uh, I always think whenever I think of Strabane and Lifford, I always think of going over the bridge and looking
yeah.
to my say if I'm going from Lifford, going into Strabane, I always look right and I look out and I see the river and I just see the way it's laid out, and automatically I just thought, yeah, that's it there on the page. How did you like you might choose the area? Were you living there or at the
Yeah,
time?
well, by that stage, my wife is from Strabane, so we had ended up kind of living in Strabane. I moved there when we got married. So because I was living in the area, and also one of the things, I mean, you're absolutely right. And when we were kids, like Buncrana was our destination of choice every Sunday.
Hmm.
When you were going out for a run, you went from Derry to Buncrana or to Fawn. But the thing that I loved about the Lifford Strabane location was that you had these two kind of towns literally separated by a bridge, and that bridge is where the border is. And this was before the bridge, the TV show, and kind of what I wanted was a crime where a body was found in the border, which has been done since by the bridge and the tunnel and all those other things. But Lifford and Strabane seem perfect because you have the two towns are so close, and there's just this kind of this narrow space between them. And I remember whenever I was young, whenever, as I said, we used to go to Buncrana or Fawn every Sunday because my parents went down to get chef brown sauce because you couldn't get it in the north. So we went down for the Donegal to get chef brown sauce. And you went through the British Army checkpoint, which was
Yeah.
this huge military hangar. And then you would kind of drive for about 100 or 200 yards until you got to the customs post, which was more often than not one man standing with a road sign.
Mhm.
Um, but I remember whenever I was like when I was a kid, when I was away, it was the 100 yards. It was the gap between the two that I found fascinating because it was like, who's in charge here? Because the army were up there and they're down there. So who owns this bit? This kind of no man's land in the middle. Um, and that's what the Borderlands are in the first book. It's that idea of this kind of liminal space between one side and the other, and that's Devlin's terrain. That's who polices that space. To kind of in answer to the 6-year-old or 8-year-old me that was looking out of the car, that's the person who polices that space. And that physical space works best in Lifford Strabane because they're so close together that that physical space is literally the river, really. And also just I love the area. I mean, Lifford's a beautiful town, and Strabane actually is a beautiful place. So like you have these two towns surrounded by kind of rolling countryside,
Yeah.
um, which were kind of artificially divided, if you like, by the border being placed there, and yet people in Strabane in those days, anyway, when the prices were cheaper, would have been driving into Lifford every day to buy petrol. And the cinema for both towns is in Lifford. So if you live in Strabane, you want to go to the cinema, you're going to Lifford. So you're cutting backwards and forwards across the border every day. And when we were kids, it was a really big deal because you knew you were going through the border. Our own youngsters had no idea. So,
Mm.
and you were just driving backwards and forwards, and they didn't know whether they were north or south, and it didn't matter to them. So yeah, it was that kind of proximity, I suppose, of the two towns, and the fact that because Lifford is very small and quite compact, that everybody would know everybody else. Because Derry kind of has that. Everybody in Derry knows everyone else, but Derry is a very big city. And it's a big city. Whereas you have that idea of everyone knowing everybody else in kind of Lifford and Strabane, and the area is kind of compact enough that that's believable, I suppose.
So the process of writing a series, I can only imagine it doesn't get easier as each one goes by, and to add to add more work to your plate, you don't have just one serial character. You have two serial characters. You got Benedict Devlin and Lucy Black.
Yes.
You're creating two worlds, and you have
Yeah.
to. How do you do it?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Kind of looking back, I suppose. I mean, in terms of writing one series, the difficult thing for me is that, firstly, remembering the choices that you make. I remember with the third Devlin. So in the first Devlin book, his son Shane is, I think, 6 months old, and he's kind of putting him to bed and bottle feeding him and stuff. And the third book, which is meant to be set kind of several years later, I was kind of in the first draft of it. Shane was in one scene. Shane was sitting on the rug in the living room, chewing on a Farley's rusk
Mhm.
with his one good tooth. And I was kind of writing this and quite happy with it. And then kind of went, that child is actually probably about 4 by this stage. He's not just sitting eating Farley's rusks. He's talking and walking and doing stuff. And that actually for me is one of the big difficulties because I remembering the choices that you make, and bearing in mind that those choices then have kind of long-term consequences.
Mhm.
So something happens to Devlin's partner, Caroline Williams, at the end of the second book, which felt completely right in the second book. But when I was writing the third book, I was kind of going, oh, kind of wish I hadn't done that now. But you have to kind of live with the consequences of the choices that you make. And then what happened with Lucy Black was kind of two things around the same time. Firstly, after having three sons, my wife and I had a daughter, Lucy. And so I kind of wanted to write a character for her. Um, and the idea that I had for the book was about it kind of came from a friend of mine who was a clinical psychologist who had been talking about how children respond to childhood trauma, particularly trauma that they can't talk about. And he said one of the ways in which he could, or people who were working with the children could identify the type of abuse that they had suffered, um, was by finding out which fairy tale they most identified with, because the fairy tale would say something about the trauma. So children who were abandoned, so where there was kind of parental abandonment or emotional neglect, quite often those children would associate with Hansel and Gretel because it was a story about children being abandoned by a parent figure. Where there was kind of violence or physical assault involved, Red Riding Hood, because you have a kind of a predatory figure disguised as a family member, the wolf dressing up as Granny. And I mean, it's not foolproof by any stretch of the imagination, but he said he just had noticed that this certain stories resonated and they often reflected the form of trauma that somebody had suffered. And the idea that I had for the book was that this child is out wandering in a blizzard, who clearly has witnessed something because she has blood on her clothes, but it's not her blood. She's not able to speak, and nobody claims her, nobody reports her missing. And so my idea was that the police officer who sits with her in the hospital at night reads stories to her to pass the time. And in reading one of the stories, inadvertently triggers a reaction from the child, which becomes the kind of the gateway into the investigation. So that was the plan for the book, and almost instantly I knew two things. I knew it couldn't be Devlin for two reasons. One, because they wouldn't have a male police officer sitting with a female child. And secondly, Devlin had his own family and he wouldn't be sitting in the hospital at night with this child. And I also wanted to set the book in the north because things had settled. The PSNI kind of had established. The politics around it seemed to have kind of resolved. And I had always wanted to set a story in Brehane Woods because I grew up in Brehane.
Oh yeah.
And beautiful woodland, this kind of ancient woodland that we spent our time in when we were kids, kind of playing. And so I wanted to set a story there. So all of that kind of coalesced, and I went, right, well, this probably needs to be a new character. And it should be a woman, and she's going to be called Lucy. And the original plan was to call her Lucy Black, or Lucy Blake. Sorry, the original plan was to call her Lucy Blake because I kind of knew quite early on I wanted the book to be called Little Girl Lost, because it was based around a William Blake poem
Okay.
of that name about a child who goes into the forest kind of as an infant, and when she is found, she's moved from a song of innocence to a song of experience. And I kind of posted after I'd finished the first draft of it. I posted on social media something about it and kind of said, "I'm introducing a new character, Lucy Blake." And the first comment that came back was, "You know, there already is a Lucy Blake in crime fiction." So kind of, all right, I didn't, but now I do. So rather lazily, I suppose, I changed it from Blake to Black, and that was why she became Lucy Black, to be totally honest.
I could just
So,
imagine it, black then question mark. Yeah, good to go. Yeah.
so
So
yeah, that was it.
that's and again, it's set in the north. How have you felt that the north itself has changed? So when you started with the Benedict Devlin stories to where you come now with Lucy Black, how do you feel it has changed as society? Because it's a very different place from what I remember it going all those years back to where we are now.
Yeah, no, it is entirely. And I mean, even I think one of the things that happened with the Devlin books was that I wrote four or five of them. And like growing up, the border was a really big part of our lives. Do you know what I mean? Because we were growing up quite close to it, because we were crossing backwards and forwards, and because it was so physical and so there. And even though kind of after the Good Friday Agreement, the infrastructure vanished, the psychological border took longer to
Mm.
go. It was still there. You were still aware of it. But I think by the time I kind of got to the fifth Devlin book, it may as well not have been there anymore. I mean, as I say, our kids had no concept of it. You were driving backwards and forwards every day, and so it kind of it lost significance to me. And at the same time, Derry seemed to be kind of finding itself a bit. I mean, for long enough. I mean, certainly again when I was growing up. I mean, Derry for anyone who doesn't know it, Derry's kind of split down the middle by the Foyle, by the River Foyle, and you have two banks. You have the city side and the water side. Um, one of which would be considered to be predominantly nationalist, one of which would be considered to be more unionist. Um, and I grew up on the water side, but on the outskirts of the water side. And so there was all kinds of things with Derry in terms of, and even the fact the name of the city, there was lots tied into identity and kind of geographical markers and where you were from and what you called the place you were from and what that said about you. And the two sides of the river, or the two sides of the town, when I was growing up, you kind of felt like they were kind of they had turned their backs on one another. And genuinely, and this is possibly being maybe a little bit kind of hopeful, but I kind of got a sense around kind of the 2010s, and particularly as we came towards the City of Culture year and the building of the Peace Bridge. I mean, I remember when the Peace Bridge was being built, people were going, "Do we really need a footbridge?
Mm.
Like there are two bridges in the city, do we need another one?" And in actual fact, it changed the centre of the city because it actually kind of tied together the park and the kind of St. Column's Park and Ebrington on the water side with the Guildhall and that area in the city side. And an awful lot of people started using it, and you got a sense that the kind of two banks turned to face one another and kind of acknowledged one another. And I don't know. I kind of, as I was writing those Lucy books, and I think I actually say this in the first one, but you just get a kind of sense of hope. You got a sense that the city was starting to reconcile itself
Yeah.
with its own past. And then there was the apology for Bloody Sunday and everything that had happened after that. And there's just a sense of, right, that we're kind of moving in the right direction.
Yeah.
And the city's kind of embracing itself. And I still hope that that's the case. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's always stories, and you always hear there's horrible things, unfortunately, that happen everywhere. But I kind of genuinely think that the Derry always kind of, I suppose, it always feels left out in comparison with Belfast, and certainly in terms of infrastructure and governmental funding, the West has been completely left behind. I mean, it's just appalling the inaction over roads, railways, infrastructure's vanished completely. There's nothing. Universities underinvested, but there's a sense of pride in the city.
Yeah.
I think, and a sense of kind of people acknowledging and embracing the differences within the city. And that to me is a sign of hope.
So,
Um,
so in relation to when you released the books, what was the reaction like? Say when you released the first Benedict Devlin book. I mean,
yeah, your first book's always weird because I think people assume that everybody in it is based on a real person.
okay.
Mm. And they kind of are and they're not at the same time. I mean, there's no single character who is based on a single person,
Mhm.
but every character that you write is both a kind of a version of you because you need to understand them. I mean, if you're writing a character and you don't understand why they're doing what they're doing, then the character's not working. Um, but they're also, I mean, writers are magpies, and you kind of see and you hear things, and you kind of the shiny bits of conversation and that, and you go, oh, well, I'll hold on to that. We'll use that later somewhere. And people come and tell you stories. I mean, I remember, I think after the second Devlin came out, we were at Mass in Lifford one Sunday morning. And just after Mass, we were kind of heading out to the car with the kids. And this man kind of sidled up and he went, "Are you the writer?" Was that like it just and I kind of went, yeah. And he said, "I've got a story for you." And when people say that, sometimes your heart sinks because sometimes what is a story isn't actually a story; it's an anecdote. Um, or and you kind of don't. But he went, "I have a story for you," and he said, "Do you know that above the bridge there's only as many people as want to can fish, but below the bridge they limit the number of netmen, and the netmen can't get any work anymore. So you write about that, son, in your books." And then he walked off. That was it. That was the entire conversation. And I kind of at the time went, right, well, I'll do my best. I'm not using that. Like I have nowhere to put that. Um, and then a couple of years later, I was writing The Nameless Dead, which is a book about an island in the center of the foil, where there's a dig for the disappeared, and in the dig for the disappeared, they uncover the remains of a Kilini or the burial site of unbaptized children. Because at one stage the church wouldn't allow children who died before baptism
Mhm.
to be buried in consecrated ground, and so often families buried their infants along the border because it was seen as being symbolic of the limbo that the church uh, said that these children would be trapped in because they hadn't been baptized. Um, and the idea for the book came, there was a priest, a very good man in Derry called Paddy O'Kane, who heard about this having happened. And he went round a lot of the fields around the border in Donegal with the families of people who had, or with the families who had buried children years earlier. And he went out and blessed the fields where these children had been buried so that they would be buried in consecrated ground, which I thought was just the most lovely, humane, human thing to do. Um, but so I wanted to write about that, and I also wanted to write about the disappeared, and in particular the fact that one of the consequences of the legislation over the recovery of the remains of the disappeared was that any evidence of a crime that was uncovered in a dig for one of the disappeared could not be used for a prosecution.
That's right.
And I kind of, when I read that, I went, that can't be right. And so I was very, very fortunate that I managed to get in contact with the man who was in charge of the overall responsibility for the search for the disappeared. It's man, Jeff Nuffer. He was responsible. He was involved in the Murs murders, recoveries, and all. And it was just. Um, and he said, yeah, that's kind of it. He said, if we discover something that's related, that's not related to the kind of a paramilitary crime, we can't do anything about it. We literally have to put it back into the ground, or else it will be the remains will be taken and buried and everything else, and will be given a proper funeral, but no prosecution can ever come from it. And the idea, I suppose, was that it was to encourage people who had knowledge to
Mhm.
share that knowledge, knowing that they would be free from kind of repercussions for doing it. And so I wanted to write a book where, in the search for one of the disappeared, they uncover a grave of unbaptized children, and it becomes clear that one of the children has been murdered. And so Devlin, of course, wants to investigate it and is instantly told, "You can't investigate it. Legally, we are not allowed to investigate this murder, even though it's not a paramilitary killing." Um, and so I kind of wanted to deal with the ethics of that. How do you tell somebody whose only concern is justice and safety for his own children that he can't investigate the killing of a child? But when I was writing that story, it's set on an island in the middle of the foil, and at one point Devlin goes to visit a man who brought the remains of the unbaptized children onto the island, a kind of a Charon figure, if you like, or the kind of the crossing of the sticks. Um, and I thought, well, who's going to have a boat to cross the river? Well, it's going to be a fisherman.
Hmm.
And if somebody goes and visits a fisherman, what's the first thing he's going to say? And so when Devlin goes and visits this guy, he goes, "Here, I'm telling you something, son. Do you realize that you can have as many fishermen as you want above the bridge, but there's only three allowed underneath the bridge?" And it was about 5 years later, and as I was ready, I was going, "Thank you so much to that man who stopped me outside of the church." So you do like you hear things. It's a very long-winded story, but people tell you things, or you hear things, or whatever, and you kind of merge them, or you merge them all together. And but to answer your question, when the first book came out, people kind of assumed that each character was based on one single person. And in the book, Devlin has a kind of an old flame, Miriam, I think she's
Mm.
called. And several times in the book, it comments on the fact that when he knew her, she wore coconut scented skin lotion. And every time he meets her, he thinks he can still smell coconut in her wake.
Sorry.
And somebody said to my wife one day at her work, "So which of Brian's friends smells of coconut?" I was like, so do I think so? Yeah, people kind of assume, and the only thing is, as the books go on, I think then people kind of go, right, okay, maybe they're not actually based on real people. Maybe this is kind of an act of imagination. But yeah, so it's strange. It's yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes people reveal more than they mean to by kind of going, "Is that based on me or is that based on so and so?" And you're kind of going, "No, it wasn't." But that's interesting that you saw yourself there. So,
So in terms of like Irish crime fiction, it seems to have become so popular in the last 20 years.
yeah.
It's just exploded really. Why is that? Why are people picking up the books? And like it's always been a popular genre, but for all of a sudden the Irish writers seem like John Connolly came out with that first book. Oh, the name escapes me now, but it was a game changer back
Everyday
in 90.
thing.
Every Dead Thing, that's it.
Yeah.
It was a game changer. And then, of course, then everyone else starts, publishing their books as well. What
Yeah.
is it? Why is it so popular? Why do people pick it up?
I'm not, to be honest, I don't know. I mean, it's like even in the north, whenever I started, there were, I think, three. I mean, I kind of knew of three crime writers. Really, there was Colin Bateman, Adrian McKenty, although he started a little bit later. So there was Colin Bateman, Owen McNamee, and a man called Eugene McEldowney.
Hmm.
And now I think just in the north, I think there's 26 or 27 of us who are regularly publishing crime fiction. And likewise in the south, and now particularly, there's kind of been this explosion in women crime writers, the killer queens.
Hmm.
You like Liz Nugent and Jane Casey and Andrea Carter, Andrea Mara, Sam Blake. You've got Catherine Ryan Howard, Gil. It's just there's huge numbers, and then likewise, I suppose in the north, you've got Claire Allen and Sharon Dempsey and Claire McGowan and Kelly Crichton. Um, but I think it's just there's something reassuring about the crime novel. The crime novel is a way for people to deal safely with their fears.
Hmm.
Um, and I suppose from a kind of Northern Irish perspective, during the kind of violence, you didn't need something to deal safely with your fears because they were kind of there on the street. Did I mean you didn't need a kind of vicarious experience of fear because there was an actual experience of fear. So it didn't surprise me hugely that kind of crime fiction took off after the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, those writers who were writing during the violence that I can think of, Colin Bateman was writing from a very satirical point of
Yeah.
view. Owen McNamee was writing kind of factual, a fictionalized version or imaginative responses to real events. And Eugene McEldowney was writing police procedurals, which are really, really good, but I don't know if they ever quite caught with the public kind of imagination or or got the readership that they deserved. Um, but kind of since the violence ended, I think people are possibly a bit more open to it. I mean, I think the other thing for me, certainly from the North's perspective, the crime novel does two things at the same time. It's two different stories. One is the story of the crime, and all of that happened before the book began. And then the second story is the story of the investigation, which is actually the story of the book. So what you have is when the book begins, you are at the end of something. You're at the end of somebody's life. A body has been found. And as the book moves forward, the detective is continually looking backwards to try to work out how how we got to the point where the story started. So the end of the crime novel is when you finally understand the start of the crime novel. So it's kind of doing these two things simultaneously. It's moving forwards but looking backwards. And so it's rooted in the present, but it's about the past. It's about something that happened, and how did that happen? And that to me made sense as the perfect way to explore kind of the North and what happened in the North. We were trying to move forwards, but you were also looking back and kind of going, right, how did we get ourselves to that stage? How did if only if we can understand how we got ourselves to that point, we can at least avoid doing it a second time. We can learn from it. And so I think that, I mean, certainly for me, the crime novel does that really, really well, that kind of moving forwards and looking backwards. And by the time you get to the end of the investigation, you've worked out how the crime happened and why it happened. So the end of the book brings you to the start of the book. Um, and I tried to do that. There's a book, one of the standalones that I wrote called The Last Crossing, which is about three members of a terror cell who 30 years previously had killed a fourth member of the cell and buried them in a forest outside Glasgow. And 30 years later, they all meet up. They hadn't seen one another since they all parted ways. And 30 years later, they meet up and get on the ferry to go back to Scotland to try to remember where they had buried this person so that their remains could be returned to their family. And it's about kind of the consequences of violence on those who committed it. So rather than kind of focusing on, if you like, the kind of the police or the investigation or the victim, it was about how does an act of violence affect these three people who are all responsible for it, and how have they reconciled themselves to it? Have they reconciled themselves to it? And then what happens when you bring the three of them together 30 years later? And the book does this thing which I had tried to do in Little Girl Lost. It was a thing called concatenation, where the last line of one chapter is the opening line of the next chapter. And the book moves between past and present. So one chapter is set in the 1980s, and then the line that it ends, or the word that ends it, is the opening phrase of the next chapter, which is in the present day. So you keep kind of moving between past and present in this continual wave. And the last line of the book is the first line of the book. So when you get to the end, you're kind of getting to the start. And that was that idea of the crime novel begins where it starts, or sorry, the crime novel ends where it starts. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that, and I also think just people. I mean, Ireland has a really rich history of genre fiction. I mean, Maeve Binchy was groundbreaking in so many ways because she popularized reading. I mean, this had happened before. I remember my dad reading Walter Mackin, but she really popularized the idea of that reading didn't have to seem like hard work, that you could read about people that were like you and weren't living in the big house, and you know, I mean, they weren't
Yeah.
separate. They were us. And the crime novel, I think, is an extension of that. There's a familiarity about it. People know what they're getting. You kind of know what the form is going to be, and you kind of are safe enough in knowing that there's going to be a resolution at the end of it. But it's a really good way to explore contemporary issues or explore kind of I suppose, social concerns, which seems to be the big kind of thing at the minute. There's an awful lot of domestic noir. There's an awful lot of kind of relationships within families and between neighbours and kind of within the local community. Um, and that seems to be where the big focus in publishing is at the minute. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think John Connolly, to go back to John, I mean, he was one of the reasons why I started writing crime, because I read Every Dead Thing and went, this is somebody from here who wrote that, and it's incredible. It's possible for somebody from here to write those types of books. And not only did he kind of inspire, I think, an awful lot of crime writers, but he was hugely generous with his time and with support and blurbing people's books and inviting people. Like has invited me multiple times to kind of do events with him, and I mean he's not benefiting in any way
Yeah.
from the audiences that I or somebody else will be bringing in, but he's just he loves books. He loves crime writing. He's just a very decent human being. And yeah, I don't know if he's ever getting quite the credit that he should get for really being at the start of that wave of crime fiction from Ireland.
So what does the future hold for you, Brian? Is there anything in the pipeline or?
I am just finishing. I kind of think I've about two chapters left on a new book.
Oh,
And
great.
I was working on it just before I came on the Zoom because I'm trying to get it finished. So yeah, I have it's another standalone, and I can't say an awful lot about it to be totally to be totally
Yeah.
honest because it's
Do,
probably going to change. It's going to change a bit, but. Yeah, it's a standalone about somebody who is put into a very difficult position.
okay.
That's all I can say, I'm afraid.
No, that's fine. I won't push. I look forward to reading it. But I suppose for anyone that's thinking about taking up the pen or opening up that Microsoft Word document or dusting down the grandfather's typewriter and putting a few words on the page, what advice would you give them?
Ooh, do it. I mean, yeah, and it seems simple to say just do it, but yeah, just do it. I mean, I have to say, a kind of a bugbear that I have is when you meet people and they go, "Oh, if I only had time, I'd write a book." And this was said to me numerous times when I was a head of department in a school, had four children, and was writing books at night, like at the 2 o'clock in the morning, then getting up again at half 6 or half 7 to get
Mm.
the kids sorted, to then go in and do a day's work, to then come home and help my wife with everything in the house, and then get the kids to bed, and then sit up writing for another 3 or 4 hours and you're kind of going, yeah, because I have so much free time. So this idea of if I had time, I'd write a book is actually nonsense. I don't buy it. If you have a book that you are compelled to write, and I think writing is a compulsion. I don't really think it's a choice. I think you have something in you that just is compelled to to make sense of the world through telling a story. Um, and if that's the case, if the compulsion is strong enough, you will make time. Now, you might not do it until you're 70, and that's fine, but you will make time. At some point, you'll go, right, I need to get this out of me. Um, in terms of actual practical advice beyond writing it, I think the big one, and maybe this applies for crime writing particularly, but certainly it's the way that I work. You have to write every day. Not 365 days a year, but once you start a book, you have to work at it every day. And you have to move it forward every day. I normally aim for about 1,000 words, which in a crime novel is around about a chapter, probably, if they have kind of quite short chapters, because it creates that sense of momentum and speed. Um, but the reason why I say that is because once or twice I found that I would start something and I would get kind of the first 10,000 words on any new book are brilliant because you're fired up with enthusiasm for the book, and because you haven't started it yet, in your head, this is going to be the book that ends books. This will be the book that, when it's published, all other crime writers will read it and go, well, there's no point writing anymore because the greatest crime novel of all time has been written, and that's it. And in your head, that's what it's going to be. And of course, as soon as you write the first word, it stops being perfect. And then with every word after it, it becomes increasingly imperfect.
Mm.
But the first 10,000 words, enthusiasm carries you along because you're kind of going, yeah, this is really good. And you're getting into the story and you're setting up everything. And then after about 10,000 words, you kind of start slowing down a little bit because you have to start thinking about, right, how am I setting stuff out here? And then you get to about 30,000 words. And every single writer that I know around the 30,000 word mark hits a wall where you kind of go, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm spinning about 25 different plates here, and I can't work out which ones are meant to be kept going in which order. And I don't even know why anybody would want to read this because it's shit. Excuse my language, but every writer I know has that moment. And the trick is to keep going anyway. And what I found was with one or two books that I ended up abandoning, you'd get your first 10 or 12,000 words done with enthusiasm, and then you'd wake up a day and go, oh, I'll maybe just leave it today. I'll come back to it tomorrow. And then you'd leave it a few days and you would come back to it. But when you come back to it, you'd not remember how far you'd got.
Hmm.
And that meant that you had to reread it to remind yourself what had happened. And as soon as you start rereading it, you realize that it's not perfect because it was only perfect until you wrote the first word. And so you do one of two things. You either lose faith in it because you're reading it going, this is terrible, or else you go, oh, I need to rewrite this. And then you start rewriting it and repolishing it, and you get to the same point of 12,000 words again. And then you wake up and you go, "Oh, I don't really know what I'm doing now next with it. I'll leave it a day or two." And then you come back and then you look over it again. And what ends up happening is you rewrite the opening over and over and over and over to put off moving the story on. And so you might 3, 4 weeks later, you're still only 12,000 words into it. You've changed them 4 times. And the actual truth is that the start of the book always changes when you finish it. Because by the time you get to the end of the book, you realize what it was actually about all along. And
Hmm.
then you have to go back and change the opening anyway. So the idea of trying to get the opening perfect is a total waste of time because you don't actually know what that book is until you've written the last word and then you know what it's about. So my advice would be ignore the idea of refining the opening of the book. You just write every day. You get your whatever it is, if it's 100 words, 500, 1,000, whatever you can manage. But if you do that every day, you're chipping away at it and you're chipping away at it and you're moving the story forward. And you're not having to read back over stuff. I don't read over. I write the entire first draft and then you can read back over it again and then you can start making your changes and you can start refining it. But it's in terms of the first draft, get the first draft down. And the easiest and the only way to do it is work every day. And to be totally honest, if you're doing 1,000 words a day, you'll get a first draft done in about 6 weeks. Ian Fleming wrote each of the Bond novels in 6 weeks. I mean, if you're doing 1,000 words a day and the average novel's around about 80, 90,000 words, then do you know what I mean? Even when you think you're doing 1,000 words a day, as you get towards the end, you'll do more because by that stage you know where you're going. And the enthusiasm of getting near the finish line, actually you'll end up doing 2 or 3 thousand words in a day. They might not be great, but that's okay because that's what the redraft process is for. So yeah, that would be my advice. Definitely do it. Just make yourself sit down and do it, but write every single day and read as much as you possibly can. See what everybody else is doing and don't copy them. Bring something new to it. Look for where the gap is. Look for what other people aren't doing and do that. And write what feels true to you. Because if it doesn't feel true to you, it'll not feel true to a reader and they'll see it straight away.
So that's my interview with Brian McGilloway. Please see all links relating to Brian and his work down below and check them out. You will not be disappointed. We'll be back in a fortnight with our next guest. Until then, please like and share where and when you can. Until the next time.